Let's start. And here we go. So today's class, we're going to be going over DC buyer agency agreements and listing agreements. If you were in my class yesterday, we went over the whole contract. Now we're taking a step backwards, looking at the agency agreements and listing agreements. And I'm going to start with the buyer agency agreement. These are and disclosures. These are a little bit, since there's not as many as the listing itself. And as we go along, if you have any questions, just interrupt me and go ahead and ask away. I'm not going to cover every paragraph, trying to hit all the highlights and point out a few things you might not be aware of. So let's go ahead and get on with it. If actually, before we do, does anybody have any burning questions they want to ask right off the bat, or anything they want to make sure I cover?
No questions here.
Okay, and Brian, I think you said you don't have your DC license yet, but you're working on it.
Yeah, so the Virginia one should be coming in hopefully in 1 to 2 weeks, and then gonna start DC right after that.
Okay, and Shanta, how about you?
Yep, I'm licensed in DC. I do most of my business there, or here.
Okay, very good. Well, let's get into it. This is the buyer agency agreement. Most of the stuff on top should be self-explanatory, date and name of the parties. The broker, you want to put the firm, KW Metro Center, not occasionally I'll get a contract and that has my name on here, even though I'm the principal broker, but they're referring to the firm name here. And I highlighted a few things that I think are noteworthy. And broker responsibilities, pretty much to represent the buyer's best interest and find them a property. The buyer responsibilities, sometimes you want to point this out to buyer, because buyers come from, the first time buyers, sometimes they don't have a clue what they're getting into, or maybe they're an experienced buyer, but it doesn't hurt to point out that, hey, part of the deal is you're working exclusively with one broker. And when they use the term broker here, they're referring to brokerage firm and also you as the agent. So you can substitute agent here if you want, if that helps you. So let them know that they have to work with you exclusively. And at any open houses, they agree to notify the person holding the open house that they're working with an agent. In fact, I find it a good practice if you have a buyer that's going to be going around to open houses, to give them a stack of your business cards they can hand out. That way they won't be pestered by the listing agents or the person holding the open house. It also mentions here for new home sales, it says the buyer is agreeing to make any first visit with the agent. So a lot of new homes or condos or even co-ops, if a buyer is not accompanied by their agent, they're not going to pay a commission. So you definitely want to get paid to let your buyers know if they go out. It's fine to go to open houses, but if they go to anything new, that you should accompany them the first time. Paragraph 4, this is where you put the compensation, what you're going to get paid. You can either usually you put a percentage of the sale, 2.5%, 3%, whatever your going rate is, or a fixed dollar amount. Don't put both. That's why it says or, so either or. And then you could also point out to them, in most cases, the seller is going to pay the commission. And if you charge a transaction fee or admin fee, whatever you want to call it, you put that in here. That'd be in addition to the commission. And this agreement has a certain protection period. So after this ends, you can put whatever your number of days you want to put here, 1, 10, 30. And so if the buyer ends up writing a contract for a property that you showed them, well, you'd still get paid the commission if it falls within this protection period, unless the buyer signs on with another agent. So that's protection period ends when they sign with somebody else. You can let your buyer know that if it's in, properties listed in MLS, it's going to pay a commission. It's listed there. And I tell my buyers, if we find a FSBO, that generally I can work with the seller and they'll pay a commission too. But I always tell them I'm going to alert you first anytime that doesn't apply, or if there's an issue, or anytime we're going to look at a FSBO, we'll have that cleared up ahead of time. The term expires at 11/59 on a certain date. Don't put 30 days or 60 days or whatever. Put an actual date in here. Now, I've had some agents come to me and say, "Hey, we wrote a contract, but we have a 30-day closing period, but the agency agreement ends like in the middle of that. What happens?" Well, this agreement automatically extends until settlement. So if you have someone under contract, it's gonna extend. This is especially true for new construction, which can it could take a year or so out or more. So you sleep better at night knowing that, hey, you're still covered by this agreement and it extends until settlement. This agreement, if it terminates at the expiration date, if you want to terminate prior to that, it has to be by mutual written consent. Now it says mutual, but hey, if a buyer doesn't want to work with you, it's going to be, I would let them go. What's the point? If they're not going to work with you, you don't want to work with them either then. In Maryland, it's a little bit separate. You can actually specify the terms, how that can be canceled unilaterally. I have a section on disclaimers here. It's good to point out to the buyer, hey, I'm a real estate agent. I can only give so much advice. If you want advice on legal or tax or appraisal, home inspection, surveyor, I could refer you to somebody else. The legal one's an important one to keep in mind. You're not an attorney. Don't, at least most of you aren't. So don't pretend to be one, and refrain from giving legal advice. Now, if the seller is not represented, if it's a FSBO, you can do what's called ministerial acts. So you can still fill out a contract, for the seller. You just can't give them advice. That'd be a ministerial act. As I mentioned, when they refer to a broker in this agreement, they're also talking about you, the agent. You're an agent of the broker. This is covered by the DC law. And also, it says you're going to adhere to the code of ethics. So it's written into here. If you're not familiar with the code, I would recommend reading that often. Outlines different methods of delivery, pretty much hand carried, email. I don't know if anybody uses fax anymore, but that's still acceptable means. And this is a short agreement, it's only 2 pages, but you do want to check the box for consent for dual and designated. Some agents think, well, I don't need that until I actually run in a situation where we're going to write on somebody else's, another KW Metro Center listing. It's like, well, no, you actually need this before you can actually show another KW listing. So fill that out, and we're going to get right to that. So yeah, let's jump right to it. So this is it. So you want to get this signed when you have your consultation with your buyer. Now, as you should know, designated representation, if both agents are from the same office, or in this case, KW Metro Center, one of the 4 offices. If it's a Keller Williams Capital Property, that's not designated agency. It's got to be the same broker and ownership. And when you do designated, it's the supervising broker, which would be me for Arlington. I'd be considered the dual representative. Now, even though you have this signed ahead of time that you're allowed to show a KW Metro Center listing, when you enter into a contract, there is another form you have to sign to show that all parties consent. Any questions on this form as we go along? Another disclosure is important information for purchase of real estate. I'm not going to read every one of these. A couple things to remember. Everything has to be in writing to be enforceable. Sometimes when you're negotiating a contract, there might be some verbal back and forth, but keep in mind until it's in writing and signed by the parties, you don't really have an agreement. Most of us should know about fair housing, financing, rates vary in the marketplace. Wire fraud, this is important, and there's separate disclosure for that. It doesn't hurt to repeat it several times to your buyer. Be wary of that. If you get any emails that look a little fishy, or even if they look legit and they're telling you to send money to a different account, that's a big red flag. Let your buyers know that in DC, the recordation tax is paid by the buyer and transfer tax is paid by the seller, unless you have some other agreement with the seller. Property taxes, DC, there is a homestead exemption. I don't have all the details on that. I'd recommend looking that up, but it's a way for a homeowner, if they're occupying the property, they can lower their tax burden a little bit. And so once the property transfers, those prior limits are removed, so the tax bill can go up from year to year. What else? So one thing to keep in mind as far as property condition and disclosure for agents, this is not just DC, but this goes for Maryland and Virginia too. As an agent, whether you're a buyer agent or a listing agent, you're required to disclose any known adverse material facts that you know of. So known meaning it's actually, you know about it. Adverse means it has to be a negative, like a new roof, that's a good thing. That's not adverse. A 30-year-old roof or 40-year-old with a hole in it, that's adverse. It's got to be material, meaning it's something that could make a difference in whether a buyer wants to buy the property or not. It's got to be material to the property itself. And it has to be a fact. It hasn't, not just an opinion. You know, if the neighbor comes along and says, hey, you know, I think there's asbestos in the roof or in the ceiling, that's an opinion. You don't know for sure. You're not an inspector. So limit what you disclose to only known adverse material facts. And that goes for the listing agent too. What else we got here? Tenant rights is important to know about because tenants have a lot of rights in DC and also certain counties in Maryland. There's a tenancy disclosure form if a property is occupied by a tenant. If a buyer asks you about any, you know, hey, is this a safe area or any activity going on here, let them know that the best way, direct them to the local police department, let them know that's the best source of information. And it's not your responsibility. In fact, you should not be
saying this is a safe area or not, and then you're running into fair housing issues. So it's only the responsibility of the buyer to check that out. Security systems, electronic devices, some homes, a lot of homes these days will have cameras, security cameras, and listening devices. So, let your buyer know, hey, watch what you're saying when we're in the house. Keep your opinions to yourself because that could be used against you when negotiating the offer. Next, we have the equal opportunity disclosure. Some buyers might not know it, but there are, I'm sure, a number of properties, if they've been built some time ago, they might have some deed restrictions on the property. In my lifetime, they had deed restrictions. They couldn't sell it to certain religious groups or ethnic groups. So they might still be on the deed, but they're not enforceable. They're illegal. There are some movements kind of go throughout the country to have these removed, but it's they haven't removed them all. So to let your buyer know that they're not enforceable, they're illegal. This makes reference to the Code of Ethics. Again, you are bound by the Code of Ethics. And it says, you have to treat all parties fairly. You can't discriminate. Have responsibilities for the home seller and home seeker, meaning the buyer. Let them know they're protected. They can't be discriminated against. These are various ways they could be discriminated and what to expect. And also, as a real estate agent, if you're ever asked by a seller, I guess a buyer too, to discriminate in some way, that's illegal. You can't do that. Next disclosure we have is about brokerage relationships. Keep in mind that a lot of buyers, they don't know all the different forms of, representation, buyer agents, listing agents, designated agency, dual agency. So let them know a client is somebody you have a contractual relationship with. Otherwise, they're just a customer. A couple duties that you owe your clients as standard duties. First and foremost, you want to promote the client's best interests. Let them know that you have their best interest in mind. As I mentioned, you have to disclose known material facts about the property. And you have to maintain their confidential information throughout the process and beyond. Now, as far as customers, Code of Ethics says you have to treat all parties honestly. It doesn't say you have to treat them all fairly. So keep that in mind. We kind of talked about dual brokerage. My advice on that is to avoid it. I don't do dual agency myself. It's okay if the other party's not represented. You can do ministerial acts and still fill out a contract. And it talks about dual representation, designated representation. So just make sure your buyer knows what the two differences are and what your personal policy is on dual representation. If you're doing an FHA loan, it's a required form. Reasons why you want to get a home inspection. And then at KW, we have a number of affiliated businesses, and this seems to change almost every month. So make sure you're using the latest one. And
They should all have a date in the upper right. So this one's dated 1/15/2023. This is the newest one. Let your buyers know, have a number of affiliations. They're not required to use any of them. We just need to disclose that we have that relationship. Give some breakdown of some costs for universal title and for MBH in Old Town. And then this, it lists a number of different relationships we have here. America's Preferred Home Warranty, Home Prep, Square One, Home Inspections, Real Property Management, Prime Design and Concept, Property Management Advisors, Fairway Mortgage. So once again, they don't have to use them. And I mentioned about wire fraud, how it's becoming a real problem in real estate. So we have a separate form for that. You might think it's redundant, but we really want to get it across to buyers to be aware of, you know, a lot of scams out there for wire fraud. Now this one in particular is so important. They have boxes here for your buyer to initial. So let them know if they receive any email that looks kind of fishy, or it might look like it's coming from the title company or from you. And if it says anything about wiring money to a different account or to any account, you know, stop right there. Don't do it. And whenever, if you're not sure, you can always call the settlement agent. Let them know in advance, hey, the wire instructions will not change. So if you get an email that says anything different, stop. It's a scam. I've heard people losing hundreds of thousands of dollars because they got scammed. They thought they received an email, looked like it was coming from the title company, said, hey, our wire instructions have changed. Please send your down payment to this account number. And in a rush, they don't check it. It looks legit, so they just send the money. And the one case I know about it, like $500,000 was sent to a bank in Africa, and then from there, within seconds, it was spread out to like 7 or 8 other banks. And it took months, and the buyer never got the full 500,000 back. They got maybe half of that back, but it's a lot of money to lose. So it's real, and scammers are getting more sophisticated these days. So that was the last one I had for buyers. Any questions on any of these that we went over? If not, we're going to jump into listing docs. So once again, I'm not going to cover every paragraph. Some of these should be pretty apparent what they are. This is a listing agreement. It's a GCAR form. It's used in DC and also Montgomery County. The rest of Maryland, they use MAR forms, and then even county specific forms. But Montgomery County and DC are all part of GCAR. So you want to get seller information, the broker. Once again, they're talking about the broker firm, KW Metro Center. Listing price. Please don't put TBD. I like to see an actual price. Remember, you can always change this at a later date. And listing period. Don't put 90 days or 120 days. Put an actual date. You want to be clear about when it really ends. And once again, just like in a buyer agency agreement, if you have a listing that goes under contract and the settlement date is beyond the date you put in here, this listing agreement is still in place. It says here, extended automatically until the final disposition of a sales contract, either it goes to closing, or a contract is voided and falls out. So you're still protected. Now, as you're going through this listing agreement, there are a number of places that a seller needs to initial. The first one is asking if they want it to be entered into Bright MLS. So once again, you put an actual date, or within 1 business day of public marketing. So just remember, until it's in the MLS, you can't market the property. You can market it internally to KW Metro Center, but when you start doing public marketing, it needs to go into the MLS. Also keep in mind that once you put in MLS, it has to be available for showing. So if for some reason they're still doing work on the property and you know it's going to be another week or two, or maybe they have somebody staying there and they still want it shown, well, don't put it in as active. It's got to be ready to be shown. If for some reason you find it went active and it's not ready for showing, change it to temporarily off, with the seller's permission, of course. Another place for initials, you want to ask the seller if they want it to go into coming soon status. When it is in coming soon status, it can't be shown to anybody else. No outside agents, no agents within KW Metro Center. Can't be shown, period. And it could be in coming soon status for up to 21 days. After 21 days, it's going to go, if you don't do anything to it, it's going to go to active automatically. Now, if they don't want it to go into the MLS, they need to initial here. And if you're going to go that route, you have to, there's another form from Bright called Office Exclusive. So you got to fill that out. And you can't do any public marketing. You can only market it internally to KW Metro Center. So let them know that, it's really going to hurt the marketing efforts and probably affect the price. And they mentioned 3 reasons here, or 3 things that can happen. Last one here is important. Any reduction in exposure to the property may negatively impact the price. So if you want to get the highest price, you probably want to have it on the MLS. Paragraph 7, we go over that's where you put your fee, the brokerage commission. This line here, you want to put the total commission, not just the amount that's going to the listing side. This is going to include the buyer agent commission too. So whatever you put here, make sure it includes both sides, typically 5 or 6%, whatever your going rate is. So you can enter either a percentage or a dollar amount. Do not enter both of them. And then if you charge any kind of admin fee or transaction fee, you put in this line here. And just like the buyer agreement, you have a little protection period here. So you're still protected if, even after this expires, if a buyer saw it while the listing agreement was active during the listing period, you would still be covered. Unless the seller signed another listing agreement with another agent. And then that pretty much ends the protection period. And now, as far as where to put the buyer agent commission, you put it in this paragraph here, 7B, the second line here. First line here is for if you pay any sub agents. Personally, I put 0 in for this. Sub agency is rarely used. It's kind of a relic of the past, but they still have it. Sub agent would be another agent working for the seller. Let's see what else. Oh, so if the property goes under contract and then that contract falls out, a lot of agents don't know this, but the original listing period is extended by the number of days the property was under contract. So if your listing period is 90 days, but during that time it was under contract for 40 days, and then that contract fell out, the listing is automatically extended 40 days. Of course, you want to update that in right too, otherwise it's going to expire without you knowing it. When we're talking about the buyer agreement, I mentioned a consent for dual representation. You want to have this filled out at the listing agreement. Regarding signs, this authorizes you to put up a sign, but most condo buildings, if it's a high rise or something, they're not going to allow that. But so just be aware of what the community regulations are, and HOAs, they have their own set of rules too. We have a few other places for seller to initial. This has to do with limited access showing codes. They can either, authorize it or not authorize it. So don't leave this blank. You have to select one or the other. I typically select does not authorize. I don't like giving out one-day showing codes. A little section here on leased property. So it says the seller is going to furnish the broker with written authorization signed by, lessees to be able to show it. I would go a step further. I want to see the actual lease and said that shows me that, I have the right to show it on certain dates. And if the property is leased and has tenants in it, you want to work with the tenants and as far as showings and be on good terms with them. Paragraph 10 deals with, marketing the property and putting it on the internet, a number of places where the seller to initial and to say yes or no. So don't forget the initials or answering yes or no. The first one is, does the seller authorize it to be displayed on the internet? I think it'd be crazy not to. So make sure you check yes, have the seller initial. If they said no, you can skip these next few questions, but usually they're going to say yes, so you want to answer these too. Next question is, do they authorize the address to be displayed on the internet? Typically you want to say yes, that's a good thing. Maybe if there's some security risk or some other reason, they might not want to, but almost always you want to say yes, otherwise how is the buyer going to find it? The third one deals with automated estimates. It'd be like the Zillow's estimate. And there's a number of automated valuation tools out there. I typically say yes, because even if it's not automated, the buyers are going to be going to different sites anyways to look that up. And the fourth one is, are they going to allow unedited comments? Yes or no. Now, if they say no to any of these, remember when you're entering the listing, for most of these, there's going to be a question whether to display that or not. So make sure you check the right thing when you're entering the listing. One question that came up to me once by another agent is, hey, do I need to get authorization from the seller to put it like on military by owner site or all these different sites? And the answer is no. The seller's already given you authorization to market the property at your discretion. You might want to, at the listing appointment, you might want to show them all the different ways you advertise and where how the property is going to be showing up. You don't need to go back and get an authorization. Now, if for some reason they specifically tell you that they don't want you to market it in, say, the Washingtonian, well, you have to, you owe them a duty of obedience, so follow their lead. Inclusions and exclusions, we'll get to that. There's a specific form to fill out as far as what conveys with the property. I talked a little bit about disclosure rules for you as an agent. You have to disclose known material facts, adverse material facts. And even if the seller tells you, hey, don't tell the buyer about, the leaky basement. It only happens once a year. Well, once you have to disclose that. And that a known material fact is never considered confidential information. DC, they have a lengthy seller disclosure statement. If anything changes during the listing period, you can amend that document. Also very important, if it's built before 1978, we have lead-based paint disclosure forms and the EPA pamphlet. So if you fail to give that out to the buyer and have them initial it too, there could be penalties for that, and there's a way for the buyer to void the contract too. Wood destroying insects, also known as termites. Sellers agreed in advance to provide access in a DC contract. There's a paragraph that says the buyer gets to do it. They don't need to ask for permission, they're allowed to. If the property does have a lease on it, while this listing agreement is in place, you don't want the seller negotiating new leases or extending current leases or changing anything in it. So without notifying you in advance or without your approval. You want to be aware of that. Because let them know if they extend a lease, could make the property very difficult to sell. I once had a seller, I didn't know about it, but they extended it for another year, and I couldn't sell it then. You're limited to just investors at that point. What else? So number of check boxes here. Make sure you read these questions, because if you're used to working in Virginia, these kind of work in the opposite fashion. First one is, do they own it free and clear, free of any mortgages or lines of credit? If so, check the box and skip down to F. Now, if it does have a mortgage, you want to know the name of the lender or service provider and approximate balance. The reason why you want to know these numbers, approximate, you just want to make sure that this is not going to be a short sale. We're running into some other problems. And don't just assume these questions. You want to ask the seller, you're in default on any of the loans. And it's going to come up eventually. So it's better if you know ahead of time, you can help them out. Is this going to be a short sale? Well, if it is, there are certain forms you got to fill out and certain procedures you have to go through. Any liens against taxes, federal, state, or local taxes, any judgments against the seller. Are they going through a divorce? Did one of the owners, die? And then for FERPTA reasons, we'll get to, you want to know if they're foreign person rather. We'll get to that. Yeah, I mentioned FERPTA. That stands for Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. You want to know if they are a foreign person, which is not the same as not being a U.S. citizen. Somebody with a green card, they're not considered a foreign person if they're living here, so they're not. FIRPTA would not apply to them. But what FIRPTA, it's an important law, and if somebody is a foreign seller, the title company is going to have to withhold 10 to 15% of the proceeds to make sure that if there's any outstanding taxes, they can pay it out of that account. Now, you don't want this to be a surprise to your seller, because if they're selling a property and maybe they owe a lot of money on it and they're not going to be making much on it, the title company is going to be holding 10 to 15%. They might have to bring money to the table. So you want to know upfront and be able to estimate that. Some other general provisions. Once you get an offer, ratified a contract, you're under no obligation to continue marketing and getting, more contracts, more offers. However, if it is under contract and you do get another offer in, you still have to present that to the seller. So don't just sit on it. Paragraph 23 asks if the seller gives you authority to disclose if there's other offers or not. I typically say yes. I think that's a better way to go. Typically, the way it's going to happen, buyer agent is going to call you up and say, "Hey, Rick, do you have any offers on the place or not?" And this allows me to say yes or no. I don't give them any details about the offer, but it allows me to say yes or no. What else? This agreement can only be terminated by mutual written agreement. So the seller can't unilaterally terminate it. Now there's a few forms here we're going to get into that are filled out partially with the seller, and then you want to upload it to the listing, because there's part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is going to be filled out at the listing, and then part 2 is going to be filled out by the buyer once they make an offer and becomes part of the contract. So as I mentioned, this is used in DC and Montgomery County. To make it specific to DC, we have this jurisdictional addendum. So first question deals with the seller disclosure, whether the seller is exempt or not. And we'll get to that when we get to the actual disclosure. Another question here is asks about what kind of soil the property is on. Most sellers have no clue, and somehow I found this website that will have we got a map of DC, and you could zoom in and out, and you could locate the property and zoom in, and then there's a key down here that'll tell you different types. So you find out where the property is, and then look at the color code, the key. Yeah. Somehow I lost the ability to zoom in. So, here we go. So these will tell you all the different types of soil in DC. I have no idea what some of these names mean, but that's what you want to put into this paragraph here, paragraph 2. Tenancy is very important. You want to know if the property is occupied or not. And a tenant is somebody living there. They don't necessarily need a lease to be considered a tenant. And the important qualifier is, was the property tenant occupied when the seller decided to sell? Now, yeah, maybe you signed a listing agreement, but you're gonna wait until tenants are out to put it on the market to avoid this? No, it's when the seller decided to sell. So if they're signing a listing agreement with you today, that means, this applies right now. The reason why this is important is, one, there's a separate form, depending on whether it's single family or 2 to 4 or multi-unit. But in DC, we have what's called TOPA laws, Tenant Occupancy Purchase Act. Even though it's largely revised, I think in 2018, that exempted single family accommodations, there are still some hoops you have to jump through, and there are some situations where it still applies. So you want to be very aware of that. And of course, if it's a condo co-op or HOA, you want to note that, and there's other forms to fill out. So this is part one, seller signs it, dates it. You want to upload this with your listing. And then when a buyer goes to make an offer, they're going to download it and they're going to fill out part two here. Once again, they're going to ask about seller disclosure, whether seller is exempt or not. Here's another one you want to upload to the listing. This is going to be inclusions, exclusions. This is going to be everything that conveys with the property. Now, in Virginia, you're probably used to seeing this within the contract. And sometimes it could be a little confusing because you're filling it out and you're trying to remember, hey, how many ceiling fans were there, or was it a stove or a cooktop or whatnot. So this kind of takes the guesswork out of it. This is filled out by the seller ahead of time. A couple of things to point out. It says all surface or wall-mounted electronic components do not convey, but the mounting brackets do convey. And one thing they don't mention in this version, which I think in a future one it might, they don't say anything about smart devices. So smart device could be a Nest thermostat or a Ring doorbell. And it's kind of in the gray area, is a Nest thermostat, is that a wall-mounted electronic device or not? Some people might say yes, some no, but it's in that gray area. So if you see anything like that, go ahead and write it out, whether it conveys or not, just so there's no surprises when you do the walkthrough. If there's going to be anything that's going to be removed and not replaced, actually you could also put the smart devices here, anything that's not going to convey. Just want to be as clear as you can with this. Sometimes there might be a fancy chandelier that the seller plans on taking with them, so you want to put that here. In that case, I typically tell the seller, if it's not going to convey, let's get it out of here before it goes on the market. Let's replace that chandelier with some other light fixture. And if there's any leased items or service contracts, list them out here. So you want to upload this with the listing. Buyers are going to download it. And then part two here, they're going to incorporate it into the contract. Buyer signs it here. And then the seller signs it a second time on the left after the buyer. So we talked about the disclosure statement. Once again, this is another document you want to upload to the listing. So this talks a little bit about who's required to fill this out, whether it's for sale, or if there's a lease with an option to purchase, they need to fill this out. Paragraph 3 talks about all the different conditions where it's not required, like a court order transfer, any foreclosure, any sale by fiduciary, selling somebody's estate, or a guardianship or conservatorship. And also new construction, they don't fill out this property disclosure. They have their own disclosures that they're required to make and warranties. I said you want to upload this to the listing, and if you receive an offer and it doesn't have this, you don't want to ratify that contract. You want to make sure the buyer has it and they sign it first. Because otherwise, go down to paragraph 6, what's the remedy if the seller does not provide it to the buyer and they're required to? Well, the buyer can cancel the contract and they have 5 calendar days after the receipt of it. So you don't want that exposure out there for your seller. If they're required to make the disclosure, you don't want to accept a contract without it. So this gets into actual disclosure. One important point to note is this is for the seller to fill out. You do not want to fill it out for them. You don't want to take on the liability of saying how old the roof is or anything. So let the seller complete this. If they're not sure how to answer it, then give them some guidance, but let them make a decision. You know, for all these questions, there's an option for unknown or no. So I'm not going to go through each paragraph here. And of course, for condo or co-op, only the common elements are not, you don't have to disclose anything about them. So you can always answer not applicable to a lot of this. And I always find it, even though the seller has to fill this out as a buyer agent when I'm writing a contract, I want to look through this also, see if there's any red flags. So the seller signs it when they fill it out, and then to make it part of the contract, the buyer is going to sign this too. Another form to upload with the listing, and I think we covered this under when we talked about the buyer docs. Consent for dual and designated representation. You don't want to wait until another KW agent's filling out a contract to complete this. You want to complete this at the listing agreement and saying, yes, we consent to designated representation. I haven't found a seller say no to this. And then, of course, you also want to review what dual representation is with the seller and what your policy is and whether you're going to attempt to do that or not. I recommend not doing dual. DC is legal to do dual representation. In Maryland is not. It is not legal for one agent to represent both parties. Another document, equal opportunity in housing. We talked about this under the buyer docs. And once again, with the seller, you also want to show them the affiliated business disclosure. Once again, they don't need to use any of these. In fact, this is probably geared more towards a buyer. And we also talked about don't become victim of wire fraud. And this sounds redundant, but it's very important. And this one is so important, we ask them to initial here too. Lead-based paint disclosure. So if it's built before 1978, you got a couple of things you got to do. You have to fill out the federal form, and you have to fill out the seller has to fill out the DC form here, which is what we're looking at. And you want to upload these to the listing. And make sure they review it with them, make sure they checked everything here. So I'm just gloss over that and just sign it. And then there's a section here, C is for the buyer to sign, make it part of the contract. And then this is the federal form. So don't miss these check boxes here for the seller to check. And as the agent, you also have to initial here and sign below. And as I mentioned, if it's a condo or co-op HOA, there's a separate addendum to fill out ahead of time. Then you want to upload this to the listing. Paragraph 1 is pretty important because it covers the fees. This would be the regular fee. They're talking about the regular condo fee. Some places have a separate parking fee for a garage and even storage. And also very important is if there's a special assessment. I'm going to check on that. Now, as a buyer's agent, I'm going to be reviewing this, but I'm also going to be checking this against the condo docs because that's what really counts. You know, it's deemed to be reliable coming from the seller, but it's what's in the condo docs that is what really governs it. And I've seen mistakes before, especially if a listing's been on the market for quite some time. You know, maybe they listed in December and February you read an offer and it's still there. Well, sometimes there's condo fees go up in January, and what the seller put down here is different than what's in the condo docs. So I want to check on that, and especially for any special assessment. And separate paragraph for that, talking about the reason, payment schedule, and the remaining balance. And this is important. Anytime you see boldface type, that's pretty important. So in the agreement here, the seller's saying they're going to pay any outstanding balance on the assessment. You want to know if in a condo, if the parking space or storage is that deeded separately. If it's deeded separately, there might be separate taxation on it. It's good to know who the management company is. They do change from time to time, so make sure you get the current information. Next paragraph, paragraph 4, it talks about what needs to be in the condo docs. Part 2, this is going to be completed by the buyer when they're making the offer. And if it's accepted, this becomes part of the contract. And very important, the buyer has 3 business days to cancel the contract if they want during the condo doc review period. So 3 business days once they get the condo docs. Now, throughout this agreement and the contract itself, days refers to calendar days unless it specifies business days. So keep that in mind. Now, if it's co-op, and there's quite a few co-ops in DC, you want to complete this at listing and upload it. With the listing, it looks very similar to the condo addendum. The one difference is co-op, sometimes you'll have an underlying mortgage, and that will, underlying mortgage, it's going to be a mortgage taken out by the co-op itself, but shared between all the owners. So when one owner sells, they're also, along with the property, goes with the underlying mortgage. So as a buyer, you want to know what those terms are. And once again, as part 2, this is going to be completed by the buyer and becomes part of the contract. In the third one, similar fashion, this is for an HOA. Part 2, fill out the buyer. For an HOA, they have 5 days. It doesn't say business, it says 5 days, it has 5 calendar days once they get the HOA docs. This next form is a tenancy agreement. So if there are tenants in place while you're taking a listing, the seller needs to complete this. You need to say, list out the tenants, what units, if there's more than one unit in the building, what the current rent is. Hopefully there's a lease attached and whether they're going to be staying or not. And I mentioned a little bit about TOPA. This has been revised quite a bit in 2018 to exempt most single-family accommodations. And it's single-family accommodations, not single-family homes. So single-family accommodation could be one condo unit or co-op or townhome. Now there are a few people that still qualify under TOPA. That'd be certain elderly people or disabled tenants. And you don't get to decide if somebody's elderly or not. That's something that has to be determined by DC. So if the person does qualify, then they actually have the right to match any offers on the property and buy, and they have first right to buy it. So I won't get into TOPA too much, but just be aware it's a lot of paperwork you have to fill out if you're selling a property with a tenant in it. Even if they're not elderly or disabled, there are certain procedures you have to follow. There's certain forms you got to file with the DC government and the housing department. And the last form, you also want to upload this to the listing. This is kind of an odd form because you're notifying, when you're taking the listing, you fill this out, but the seller does not sign this. This is to notify the other party, the buyers, that you represent the sellers. And then the buyer signs it here. And that is it for all the listing docs I got. Does anybody have any questions on these? Some of these will be kind of, like I said, I didn't cover every paragraph, but covered most important pieces of it.
Are you able to share these, the ones with the red notes?
Yeah, I can send these out if you want.
Yes, I've been trying to write, but I am
I don't know.
a lot of notes.
Yeah, if you just want to send me an email,
Yep.
Send it to rick@kwmetrocenter.com.
Got it. We'll do
Send
it.
you this one and the buyer docs.
I will be doing the same. Thank you.
And then if you weren't in my class yesterday, I also reviewed the contract. I'll send you this one too.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Well, have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You as well.
Yep, you as well. Thank
All
you.
right.
Alrighty, bye.